Alright, so part 1 of my Dropzone Commander risk assessment series. Now, this series of videos will be focusing on the basic units of Dropzone Commander and exploring the different tactics and options available to them. Now that the starter set has recently come out for Dropzone Commander, I feel like a lot of people are going to be picking up this game and wanting to get stuck in with the units and really getting a good foundation of how to start this game. Now, there's a lot of tutorials online. In fact, the developer themselves actually put tutorial videos on YouTube and various other places around the internets where you can pick up the game and get stuck in pretty quick. However, this series is going to be going in a slightly different direction. It will be exploring the tactical options that you have for the basic units, not necessarily how to use them. This series won't be focusing on the rules themselves, but rather on what you can do with those rules. Now, the reason why I feel that this is an important distinction to make, because Dropzone Commander is a great game, and it's very, very in-depth as far as the subtleties and the options that you have, even right out the gate. And the CQB is going to be a good example of this. Now, if you're familiar with the rules of Dropzone Commander already, you might be asking why start with CQB. It's a pretty simple rule, and as far as talking tactics and strategy, CQB is maybe a little bit inconsequential to the system at large. And while that might be true, the fact that CQB is so simple is the reason why we should talk about it. So without further ado, let's discuss what CQB is in Dropzone Commander. Now, the closest analog would obviously be close combat for other systems, where you have a unit that is designed and upgraded in such a way that they are capable of fighting in a close combat, or at least altering the different variables of the close combat mechanic to either outweigh and unbalance the game in your favor against your opponent, or if your opponent is doing it to you, what you can do to defend yourself. The difference between this and CQB is that CQB is pretty much an unmodifiable coin flip. Now, there are other units in the game that every race has an elite troop option that has a slightly better CQB rating or capability. However, the basic units, the basic infantry for all races, is fairly similar. There are differences, but they're not necessarily significant when you're talking about what the CQB represents. The important thing to realize about CQB is that it will happen almost entirely due to the presence of a game objective. Because infantry are the only things that can participate in a CQB, more than likely this CQB will happen because the infantry is trying to locate or extract an objective for a victory point. And this is exactly why CQB is so important, even though it's such a simple rule. With that said, the title of this video might be a little bit confusing now. Why exactly is CQB a low priority when I just got done saying that it was such an important aspect of the game? This has to do with what I mentioned earlier about the CQB being an unmodifiable coin flip. At basic levels of the game, when you're dealing with very comparable units that can't be altered or changed really in any meaningful way, except for through sheer outnumbering or weakening the unit beforehand, which we'll discuss a little later. But in a straight one-on-one fight, the infantry are pretty comparable. They're pretty similar, and really there's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, at the lower levels of the game, say the starter box level, the starter box lists, you don't really have enough infantry to be able to work with outnumbering or anything like that. So we have to look for other options. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The reason why CQB is a low priority is because of this evenness, because of this similarity. When you're talking about infantry being the only units in the game that really have the ability to straight up win for you, you are basically risking them on a coin flip, especially at the starter box level. So when you are considering entering into a CQB with your opponent, consider the fact that you are more than likely going to be risking the game on a close to 50-50 chance. One of the most important things to realize about Dropzone Commander when playing is that your infantry are the most important unit you have. Most of the scenarios, if not all, involve some sort of objective capture or another, and taking these objectives and taking these items of importance from discovery to getting them off the table requires infantry to be present. So when you're considering participating in a CQB, think about what you're risking your most important unit on. This concept actually wasn't, even though it's simple in theory, it wasn't immediately apparent to me during my first couple of games, because from other systems I've been taught to be concerned about what my opponent is doing and what my opponent is trying to accomplish. So in my first games of Dropzone Commander, I saw my opponent was going after an objective, and my first thought, of course, was to contest that objective. I need to get in there. I need to prevent him from accomplishing what he's trying to do, and in that way gain the upper hand. But that wasn't the case, because the way that Dropzone Commander is designed, there is really no way to unbalance the scales, as it were, and shift the chances of you coming out on top in your favor. Therefore, when you're weighing your options on what you should do with your infantry activation, entering into a CQB should be, in most cases, a low priority. So let's discuss what other options that you might have. Again, it might not be immediately apparent when you're playing a system like Dropzone Commander, because we've all been conditioned to get to grips with the opponent and prevent them actively from achieving what their goals are. But we do have options, and we have ways around this, even at the skirmish level of the game, the smallest points level that you can play at. So what are some of those options that I've been talking about? Without a physical diagram or explanation of what I'm doing, we can just look at it from a simple perspective, and I might actually do a actual video of moving units around sometime in the future to go along with these risk assessment videos. But for now, let's look at a simple diagram that's easy to picture. In fact, I'll do something up in Paint, and you'll be able to see it right here. We're looking at a perfectly square table with an objective in the middle, an objective on the left-hand side, and an objective on the right-hand side. And according to the scenario that you get in the Dropzone Commander starter set, this is how the objectives are set up on that field. It does say that you don't have to do this exactly, but this is the best way to get a balanced, even game started. And this is actually how the scenarios in the full rulebook are laid. This scenario is laid out with the objectives across the table, like what you see here. So let's say your opponent goes first, and he is able to jet up the table and really claim this center objective here. Or it could be the side one. It doesn't really matter for this instance, but let's just say it's the center table. And he goes ahead and puts both of his infantry squads, his 6 bases, into that building to start looking for an objective. This will take a couple of turns, but let's just say he's able to pull that off, and he does it. So what kind of risks are there in attempting to go after that objective and to prevent him from discovering that objective and walking off the table with it? Well, at this level of the game, sadly, there isn't really much you can do at this point for that objective, except for to just kind of assume that he's going to find it eventually and probably get a victory point from it. But that doesn't mean that the first person to the middle building is the winner. In fact, far from it. Look at what other options we have. Utilizing movement, which we'll discuss in other videos, we can approach the other 2 buildings on the side and look for those splitting up if need be. I wouldn't recommend splitting up unless at this level of the game, unless your opponent has already shown himself to be pooling his units in the middle. The reason for this exactly is because if you split, if you're the first person into the buildings and you split up and your opponent still has the freedom to consolidate his forces on one of your split up units, then that is an entire infantry squad pretty much gone. And that's what we were discussing earlier, finding ways to tip the scales in your favor. And this is one of the rare instances where you will be able to actually outnumber your opponent in the starter set lists. But if your opponent has already made it to the center building and has clearly defined his intention to search that center building with all of his infantry, then you have the freedom with your infantry to look at the other 2 objectives. And this is an important factor to consider. Even though there are going to be units roving around the table trying to take out your guys, you can utilize movement, like I said earlier, and cover to make your way up the table. This scenario lasts 6 turns, so you should have plenty of time to slowly crawl your way up and worm your way into those buildings. The reason why the center building is so important for you to be aware of is that once your opponent has gone into that building, there isn't really much he can do to find the objective and then search the other buildings by the time that you get there. And again, unless he is able to find the objective and then assault one of the other buildings, which is a rare case, in the time that you're still looking for objectives, he's going to basically be stuck in that center building. So your options here are to ignore the center building, which kind of goes against everything that you're conditioned to really know in other game systems where you're trying to prevent your opponent from having an objective. This one, at this level of the game, you want to ignore it and find any other way around engaging in a CQB on equal footing, because again, if he's got every man he has in that center building and you meet him base to base in that center building with every infantry unit you have, then you're risking the game on a coin flip. And that's what I'm talking about by risk assessment. If he's made it to that center building, take the 2 side buildings. And vice versa, obviously, if you've made it to the center building, then your options are going to be at that point to try to prevent him from entering one of the other side buildings with locking off certain lanes of approach with your tanks and your anti-air, or placing your units to be able to counter his infantry and his transports when they leave with the objective, if they leave with the objective. Which brings us to another option that you have. In Dropzone Commander, you have the ability to damage buildings, and in doing such, you can create fallen masonry damage, which will hamper the infantry inside and damage the infantry inside. In a 6-turn game with the firepower that you have available at the starter set, this isn't necessarily the most efficient way to go about tipping the scales in your favor in order to enter a less risky CQB. However, it is an option that you have if the opponent has been able to lock you off from entering a structure and searching for an objective to either tie or win the game. Now you say, tie? Who wants to tie? We're looking to win the game here. Well, that's another option that you have. If you are locked and prevented from obtaining anything but a single objective in a 3-objective game, and let's just say your opponent is he's managed to find an objective, he's looking for another objective, or maybe he has both. Even with both, you can still win the game if you are able to take your one objective that you've been able to capture and get it off the table, which would result in a victory point tie. But at that point, it goes to kill points, and if you've managed to damage your opponent more and you're working on destroying his army the whole time and making sure that he's not able to get off the table with his own objectives, then that is another way to win the game, even though he might have been able to get to the buildings before you and hold you off. Okay, so in closing, what are the main points that this video tries to achieve? In discussing Close Quarter Battle, or CQB, in Dropzone Commander, it's important to note the differences between CQB and close combat in other systems. CQB is not close combat, where you're dealing with different items and gear and options that you have for fighting a fully fleshed out mechanic where you're battling toe-to-toe with your opponent. CQB is instead a way of working out and representing an unseen event that triggers automatically when a infantry unit enters the building when there's already an occupier. At the level of simplicity that the CQB operates at, it's almost the equivalent of rolling on a chart that has 50% or 51, 55% chance for it to work out one way, and then a pretty equal way for it to work out another way. Using this analogy, when you're dealing with a chart in any game system that has an equal chance for it to work out a bad way as it does a good way, that chart is usually avoided at all costs because of its high risk potential. And this is the best way to look at CQB in Dropzone Commander, especially in the early games. So this is the first objective of this video, to make the distinction between close combat and CQB, and to establish the fact that a CQB is something that should be avoided if given any opportunity to do so, whereas a close combat, obviously, if you're geared up for it, that's something that you should chase. The second point is paying attention to your most valuable unit on the table and keeping them safe as the number one priority. Now this goes hand in hand, obviously, with avoiding unnecessary risks, such as entering into a CQB. And at the starter box level of Dropzone Commander, there should always be a way around engaging in a CQB on equal footing with your opponent.